This video is going to take you through the invoice approval in the employee portal. When you first log into the portal, you may see a red badge next to the approval menu item. This is indicating the number of invoices you have for approval. If you go ahead and click on that, you'll be taken to the invoice approval screen. When you first enter this screen, it will default to your reviewer ID. If you were a member of one or more reviewer groups, you would see more groups here. From this top bar, you also have the option to filter by company. So if you had invoices for multiple companies, you could choose to limit your focus on one company or the other. You can imagine that if this list got quite long, if you came in, it might be a bit difficult to scroll through and find a particular invoice. In the search, you can see here, it will allow you to search by vendor or reference. So if we were looking for a Wesco invoice, we could come in and just start typing and the list will start reducing for us. Alternatively, if we're searching for a specific invoice number, we could start typing in the number and it would again reduce the list for us. Now this grid is not customizable. We cannot add any fields and we cannot delete any fields. The most we can do is sort by each column. So you can see here right now I have it sorted by invoice date. I want to have it sorted descending, so I have the oldest invoices at the top of my list and work my way through. The other column here is notes. If there are any notes on an invoice and you don't see the entire description, you can click on that note and you will be able to read the entire body of the note. Review status. This field was essentially created so that you could organize your queue similar to what we had in our previous invoice approval system. If you have looked at an invoice and you are waiting for additional details, you would mark that invoice as a work in progress, and that's your indicator that you've looked at this and you're waiting on additional information. A couple other items at the top here. By default, you're going to see show only invoices awaiting my sequence approval. The other option is show approved or rejected invoices. So if you have gone and done some approvals of invoices and they have not yet been posted by the AP clerk, then you will be able to see them in this list still. And if you had been the one to take the last action by, it was an invoice you had just approved and you realized that you approved it in error, you can come to this screen here, click undo, and it will put it back into a unapproved state. Do not click undo on an invoice that has been approved where the last action by is not yourself. This section here basically just tells us a count of invoices we have in our queue and the total monetary value pending our approval. So to launch into an invoice for review, it's easy. You simply click on the line item that you want to review. When you first come on to the invoice review screen, this upper section here is referred to as the invoice header. There is no editable fields on this section of the form. You may enter the review status, which is any text string up to 20 characters in length for you to organize your queue. You can do a review by line item, which will take the approval buttons and move them down at the line item detail. Now, an invoice can have one or more line items associated with it. However, we review and approve our invoices as a whole, not by line level, so I don't foresee us using review by line. History just allows you to see the reviewer history of the invoice. In this field is where you would enter any comments, and if this invoice met all the conditions and had all of the information needed, then this approval button would be activated. So if we pull up an invoice that has all the information, you can see here that the button is available for us to approve. The other button here is the reject button, which we will review in further detail later in the video. In this middle section here are the invoice line detail. An invoice, as we have discussed, can have one or more line items. The description that you see gives us a lot of information about where this invoice is going to be posted to. It'll give us the job number and description, the phase code and the phase description, the cost type, and the purchase order or subcontract number it will be posted against, and the associated PO or SL item number. Obviously the amount and the fact that this line item is unapproved. If we click on this arrow next to the Edit button, there are a few options. This first menu item here, Review Totals, will only be available for invoices that are linked to a purchase order or subcontract commitment in the system. Reviewing the line item totals, it will tell us the original value. If there had been an increase, it would show us the current value. This received amount is actually the invoiced amount posted so far. Backordered is our remaining committed amount, and total is again the total of the current line. If we were to pull this PO up in Vista using the PO item summary report, we would see that these totals aligned with the values that are being represented on the review line item. The other option is Edit Reviewers. Now, if we wanted to route this to another individual, it was not our invoice, to approve, then we would come in and enter sequence 1. We would select the reviewer from this list, and we would add that reviewer. At the same time, if we wanted this invoice to disappear from our queue, we would click delete on our reviewer line, and then the invoice will disappear when we close out of this screen. The other option is to add a note. There is no difference in adding a note at the line level or at the header level in this field. Both notes appear to be saved at the header level in AP Unapproved. The last item here is copy line, and that will copy this line item and create a new one for you, saving you some time on data entry. If we wanted to add a new item to this invoice, we would click on New Item, and the form would load, and we would add in the new line item details, which we will cover here in a little bit. And then this bottom section here is obviously our invoice, and if AP has attached any packing slips or POs, it will be visible in the list as well, and we can navigate through. We could choose whichever document we wanted to view in this list. There are annotations that can be added to an invoice. They are pretty limited in what can be added. However, if you did want to add, you could place your text, give it a color, indicate where you wanted it, and then you could add that annotation. When we go back, we have our text here. And if you did add an annotation and you want to delete it, you could just come in here and remove that and return to invoice. You would use this button here to add an attachment. It's fairly simple. You would browse for an attachment on your system, attach the file. If you don't give it an attachment description, then the name that will show in the drop-down list will be just the file name. And if you accidentally attach an attachment that you don't want attached to this record, there is no way to delete it from this system. What we would have to do is you'd have to email accounts payable and provide them with the AP reference number, which is the invoice number, and the name of the file that you attached, and ask them to delete it from the system. You can also download documents from here. So if I wanted to download this invoice and send it to site to get them to confirm materials have been received, or ask about a comment written on a packing slip, I can download, and I can even merge all as PDF. Now, if there was an Excel file attached, meaning a field PO, that document itself would not merge into the PDF. However, the invoice and the packing slip would. So if you merge it to PDF and you open the document, from this point here, you can click Send Email and send it out from your system. There is no direct email out from this system as there was in our previous. And these are just basic navigation buttons. You can print this current page, and the other two features that you might want to use is rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. Okay, before we get into editing of an invoice, I just want to quickly review line types. We have 5 line types that we will be using going forward. Line type 1, job, are costs that are going to be direct to a job, phase, and cost type. We have line type 3, expense. These are overhead or non-job related expenses, and they are posted to a GL code. We have line type 4, equipment. These are overhead expenses relating to a particular piece of equipment, and they too are posted to a GL code. Line type 6, PO, are linked to a PO and a PO line item. The PO must be open, and with a PO, if there are insufficient funds, a message will display showing that there are insufficient funds, but posting of the invoice will be permitted. 7, SL. These are items linked to a subcontract and SL item. Like a PO, the SL must be in an open state, and if there are insufficient funds, a message will pop up. However, posting of the invoice will not be permitted until additional funds are allocated. Multi, for those of you coming from CI, we no longer have a multi-line type. With AP unapproved, we can now have multiple invoice lines to any combination of line types. All right, we're going to go through a line item edit for a field type PO. So this is going to be posted to a line type 1 job. I want to take item number 1, I actually want to split it between 2 phase codes. Now, one way of doing this is to click on the edit button, and I want to actually split this between 2 phases. So I'm going to come into the gross amount, I'm going to change it to 443. And then down in the tax field, you can see that the basis changed automatically based on the gross amount, and it calculated the tax. So I'm going to hit the Save Changes at this time. You'll notice a message pops up here, just giving me a heads up that my total so far is less than the invoice. So now I'm going to use the copy line feature that we reviewed a while ago. In doing so, it's copied this exact line. However, you'll notice that the amount is the amount plus the taxes. So we'll want to make a change here. But first, I wanted to change the phase code to a different phase code, split it between 2. So I can come in, find the phase code that I'm looking for. I'm going to revise the amount and verify that the tax is correct, and I'm going to save my change. Now when I come back to the invoice review screen, I have 2 line items. I am balanced, and at this point in time I can click Approve to approve my invoice. Alright, let's look at line type 6 PO. Now let's say you receive an invoice that is for a commitment in the system. However, it has been coded to cost type 33. It is a good indication that your purchase order maybe wasn't interfaced at the time the invoice was received in the system. So let's go ahead and make that change. So we're going to change the line type to 6PO. We're going to type our PO number and select it from the list. Now if you had multiple POs open in your job for Westburn, then multiple would show up in that list and you would have to select the right one. So I only have one item here for light fixture, and my gross amount has remained the same as what AP had entered, and the tax basis is the same. So at this point, I could save changes and return to the main screen. Now you'll notice this little red exclamation mark that pops up. What that is telling me is that there's an overage on my totals. So if I come into the edit and I review totals, I can see that my original line item had a commit value of $973.33. My invoice total here that I'm trying to post against it is $1,887.26. So I am going to exceed the PO. Now, because this is a PO, it will allow me to proceed. And at this point, because this is the only invoice for this job, and I know the reason For the overage, I'm going to allow this invoice to be posted, and I will just close the purchase order, clearing out any negative remaining committed amounts. Another cool thing with PO purchase orders in the system now is we can actually change the phase code without having to go into the system, do a PO change order, and then come back and repull our commitment. So let's have a look at that. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, I realized that when I received this invoice, I wanted to change the phase code. It was incorrect. I can come in, and in the phase list, I can choose any valid phase code within the job, and that's all I need to do. And upon save changes, you're going to see a message saying this update will automatically process an item distribution. Continue. We're going to confirm our save. All right. So what does that look like in the system? Well, I can pull up what my original purchase order looked like here. I had one line item that was to phase 6420 for a total of $973.33. Now remember, the invoiced amount is over $1,800. So let's have a look at a PO item summary report. Here's what the PO item summary report looked like prior to changing the phase code. And this is what the PO item summary report looks like now. What the PO item distribution did was it took the amount that I was allocating to this invoice line, and it subtracted it from our first line item, which has now resulted in a negative committed cost here. And it's created a second line item for the current cost item. So you have to keep in mind that when you are doing a PO item distribution, you're changing the phase code, it is going to take the amount you are allocating to that phase code, and it is going to subtract it from the original line item that you are making the phase code change on. Just keep that in mind when you are proceeding with changing a phase code on a commitment in financial controls. All right, so at this point, totals are balanced and I am able to click approve. Now we are going to look at coding a line type 7SL and some of the items to watch for. This invoice has been created for demonstration purposes. It is to mimic an example where there was a subcontract that maybe was not interfaced at the time that AP received the invoice. So it was routed to you with a line type 1 job being posted directly to the job. So we are going to want to edit this line item. Now, subcontracts quite often will have holdbacks, and so there are some figures that we're going to need to be aware of for how to code it. So the first item we're going to do is we're going to change this to line type 7. For the SL, we are going to find our SL item, and then for the amounts, the gross amount here is the $1,000. That is the amount that is being invoiced. But this subcontract is subject to 5% holdback. So in the retainage discount section, the retainage percentage will automatically pull in from your subcontract commitment in the system. The retention amount will automatically calculate based on the retention percentage. And what we need to watch for is the tax basis. So because we are taking a $50 holdback, our tax basis is actually the subtotal amount. So we are going to need to change the basis to $950 so that the tax calculates correctly here. Once that is done, then we can save our changes. And now this item is ready for approval. Now, a few points to consider when working with subcontracts. If the retainage amount was entered on the subcontract, but there should be no holdback, then the retainage amount can be overwritten at this point, and the retainage amount entered is 0, and the system will accept it. However, if you entered your subcontract with units of measure other than lump sum, you notice that you cannot make any changes to units of measure. You will have to go back into the system, make the change, and then come back into here and update and save your changes. You will also notice in the Charge To section, the description is slightly different than when it's being posted to a purchase order. You see the item number referenced, and you see the subcontract referenced and the phase code, but there is no job description as there are on other line types. Now, the last point I wish to review with subcontracts is you'll notice that unlike the line type 6PO, there is no option to change the phase code as we had done with purchase order commitment. If you do need to make a phase code change, you will have to go into Vista, pull up the SL, and make the change in there. And that concludes the SL7 invoice demonstration. Here we have an invoice that is going to be posted as a line type 3 expense. It is going to go directly to the GL. In the Charge To section here, we can see that item 1, it's going to $91.40 software costs. Now that is correct for this invoice, but let's say it wasn't and we needed to make a change. As with the other types, we can click the Edit button. Now when we come into here, the line type 3 expense is already chosen. Let's say we want to change the GL code, or it was routed to us with no GL code and we had to find one, and you weren't quite certain what the actual code was, but you knew it had software in its description. You can type either the code or the description to limit the list of available GL codes. So we'll select our 9140. Now you notice here that the unit of measure field has a red circle around it. It was routed to us from AP with no unit of measure. However, the Save Changes button, it will not allow us to save these changes until a unit of measure has been selected. So in unit of measure, let's just type in lump sum amount, because that's what it is. And now we are able to save our changes, and then you can approve your invoice. The final line type we're going to review is the line type for equipment. As with the other line types, in the Charge To section, it provides a great deal of detail as to where this cost will be posted. It has the equipment number identified along with the description of what that equipment is. It has the equipment cost code that it is going to go to, and the equipment cost type as to where it's going to be posted to. Now let's look at how to make changes if required. So line type 4 is the line type to be used. EM company is the company of where the equipment resides. You'll notice in the equipment field there is no drop-down list. That is because there could be too many equipment. So you basically need to start typing your equipment to find it. If we type 103, it's going to come up with all pieces of equipment with 103 in it. And T103 is the one that we are looking for, so we are going to select that. The cost code is a list that you can choose from, and EMC type is a type that we can choose from as well. Component type and component are not required. As with the 3 expense, this invoice has been routed to us without a unit of measure entered. So we must input that unit of measure prior to the Save Changes button being activated. The gross amount is the net total of the invoice, and the tax code is G5, and our taxes are calculating correct. At this point in time, you can hit Save Changes, and your invoice is ready for approval. Now let's talk about some tax coding issues that we could come across. Typically, most invoices will have either GST or both PST and GST that is applicable to the entire invoice amount. However, increasingly, we are seeing invoices where PST would only be applicable on certain items. common invoices are rental invoices, where PST would not be applicable on delivery and pickup charges, or on some aggregate invoices where PST is not applicable on the cartage fees, but they are applicable on the materials. So it's important for us to be aware of those potential shortfalls and ensure that we code our invoices correctly. More often than not, when you get the invoice for approval from AP, they would have already done that analysis and coded the invoice correctly with the appropriate lines. However, in a case where they are unable to determine what PO item to link to, or maybe the PO wasn't interfaced at the time of approval, you may receive the invoice with two line items where one is broken out and it's just for PST. So before we look at the detail of that, let's just have a look at this invoice here in particular. So we can see here that we have a sales agreement total of $113.20. The PST billed is only $315, which is less than the GST. So we know that the PST was not applicable on the entire invoice. So how this invoice would be coded is you would do one line item for the gross amount total of $113.20, and then you would apply GST to that full amount. And then a second line item is added where it is just a gross amount of $315 and there is no taxes applicable on that line item. So let's have a look and see what it would look like on the line items. So we're going to go into this first item, number 1. And this is associated with a active PO, so we're going to change our line type to PO. So before I do, you can see that we have the gross amount here of $113.20, and the tax basis has been set to G5 by AP. So when I change this to a line type PO and I link to our purchase order, and I select PO item number 1, when we do that, our tax code automatically changes to what is set up for this purchase order commitment. So we'll need to watch that. However, you'll see the gross amount stayed the same. So before I save this line, I want to make sure I change the tax code back to G5 so our amount of taxes is calculating correctly. And then I'm going to save the changes. Okay, now that line number 1 has been edited and it is linked to the purchase order, we now need to update line item 2 to the correct phase code. We're going to come in and select our phase code, and when we did that, the unit of measure changed from lump sum to hours, and that is because it's tied to cost type 3 equipment, and the unit of measure in the master table is set up to default to hours. So we're actually going to change this to lump sum, and then we're going to have a look at our tax code, and we do have a gross amount of $315. We want to make sure that the type is set to blank and the code is set to blank, and the tax basis we're going to save to 0 as well, and we're going to save our changes. So now we have two line items, item 1 to the purchase order and item 2 to the correct phase code. At this point, this invoice is ready for approval. Rejecting an invoice doesn't happen too often, but there are a few valid reasons why you would want to reject an invoice. 1, it is not your invoice and you are unsure which project it belongs to. If the invoice taxes are incorrect and the vendor needs to rebill, that is something that you could pass back to AP to deal with. However, if your project is PST exempt and you forgot to indicate to the supplier at the time of ordering that it was PST exempt, it is preferred that the PM or the PM admin chases down and gets the vendor to rebill it with the correct taxes. Another reason why you might reject it is if the vendor in the invoice header is identified incorrectly. There is no way for you yourself to make that change, so it would have to go back to AP to update the header and then reroute back to you. Let's get into how to reject an invoice. To reject an invoice, click the reject button. You must select a valid rejection reason from the list. In addition to a rejection reason, you must enter comments as to why you're rejecting. This is mandatory before the reject button is available. Now that our comment is in, we can press reject. You can see here that the invoice has disappeared from this listing. However, if we were to click Show Approved or Rejected Invoices, we can see that the invoice is still assigned to us, it's just in a rejected state. If for any reason you needed to undo the rejection, you can do so at this stage. Accounts payable will be looking for rejected invoices on a regular basis and will review your invoice and why it was rejected and take the necessary action. So the invoice may show up in your queue again, or it could disappear and be reassigned accordingly. That concludes our invoice processing and approval training in financial controls. It is important to clarify that this training session just covered the mechanics of how to process and code invoices in the employee portal. There is significantly more that goes into the actual review process of an invoice before you can approve one. There is a detailed invoice approvals checklist that itemizes all the issues that our accounts payable team faces when we fail to keep our documentation or commitments up to date in Vista and our job folders. This checklist is not new, however, it has been updated to reflect the new financial controls system. Regardless if you are new to invoice approvals or a seasoned reviewer, I strongly encourage you to review this checklist at this time and on a regular basis.